Good evening, everyone, and welcome to 2022. I may be having a bad hair day today, but I'm going to ask you to forgive me for that because I am currently recovering from COVID, and I just really could use the slack right now. I could just really use a little bit of mercy. In the year 2021, I read 52 books to be exact. For years, I have been setting myself the goal of let's read 50 books in a year. And for years, I have missed that goal. This is the first time I've hit 50 books in a year. I'm very excited, and I'm never gonna try to do that again. I do want to discuss my top 10 favorite books that I read this year because I know that that's a thing. Number 10 on my list is called My Struggle, but it's not the struggle that you may be thinking of. This book was written by Karl Ove Knausgaard. I'm so sorry. This book is kind of just this guy talking about his experiences as a child with his father and then some of his adult experiences as well. Very much just sort of an autobiography of this guy that I've never heard of before. But the book is good. It's very beautifully written. This book was recommended to me by a man that I met in Korea, and that man's name was Matthias, and he was just the most incredible human, probably. Number 9 on my list is Smoke and Mirrors by Neil Gaiman. I am a Neil Gaiman fanboy. I think he's one of the greatest writers to do it. He's one of our best modern writers. He's who we got right now. Smoke and Mirrors is a book of short stories, poems, little snippets of wisdom. And I really enjoyed that book. That was one of the ones where I was like, oh, I really enjoyed that. I should put that on my top 10 books list at number 9. And so I did that. Number 8 is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. Now, Susanna Clarke, you all know, obviously, as the writer of Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell was and is my favorite fantasy book of all time ever in my life, because that book is an entire journey wrapped up into a freaking burrito, man. And Piranesi is also great. Yeah, Susanna Clarke is one imaginative cookie. That's a total lie. She's a person. Coming in at number 7, we have the book Educated by Tara Westover. This is an autobiography of a woman who grew up in this ultra psycho, I don't know if you'd call it alt-right, but it's like this conspiracy theory family with this dad who had tanks of gasoline buried underground in preparation for Y2K. Her story of her childhood is insane. The amount of times that her life is put in danger by her family is shocking. She wasn't born in a hospital because hospitals are evil, and they never took her to school because public schools are evil. Yeah, it's sort of her story of how she breaks free of that family, gets a real education, and the incredible stuff that she accomplishes in her life coming from that insane upbringing. Number 6, this book was called Evicted by Matthew Desmond. And this book just takes a look at the way that people get trapped in a cycle of poverty and homelessness. It's very eye-opening on how brutal it can be for people who get trapped in this cycle. It's immensely saddening seeing how many single mothers have to put up with this, where once you get evicted, it's harder for you to get your next apartment because you have this eviction on your record. And then it's hard for you to find jobs and hold a steady job when you're constantly moving, when you're in and out of homeless shelters, when you're trying to provide for children and you can't afford childcare and you just get trapped. And I think that this book is really important because it shines a light on this issue that a lot of people that aren't living through this don't really think about or care about or want to acknowledge. But it is so important that we acknowledge this. And I also think it shines a light on just how screwed up our landlording system can be. Landlords are profiting off of the poor and working class people and profiting off of their need to live in a place. The book also tells a story of a woman who is in an abusive relationship. Another tenant calls the cops because they hear, and the cops come and they tell the landlord, hey, we don't want this place to become an issue. And if it does become an issue, it's going to be on you, the landlord. So the landlord, what does the landlord do? She threatens the woman with eviction. So now this woman has to choose between staying with an abusive boyfriend, spouse, whatever, or being kicked out of her home. It also just shows the lack of protection that we're giving people who are in awful situations. Number 5, I read this book called 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Holy smokes, 100 Years of Solitude is so good. It's like this multiple generations of this family. It's so funky. Like, it's sort of this combination of realism, but with like this sense of magic throughout. Oh my goodness, it's almost impossible to describe, but it's like the way that these generations of this family live in this town. It is beautiful. It is so good. I loved that book. My number 4 book this year is Silence by Shusaku Endo. Silence is awesome. It's about these Catholic priests who are going to Japan to spread the gospel, but they're also looking for a priest who had gone there before them. Japan at the time was persecuting the Christians, torturing them. They're trying to force them to give up their faith. And it's the story of this Catholic priest who is seeing this abuse, this torture, these murders happen, and then he's facing it himself as well. And all the while, he's praying for God to do something or say something, to step in. These people are doing this for you. It is because they believe in you. Why are you silent? And it is just so powerful. My number 3 book this year is the best book that I read this year. And the only reason it's at number 3 is because I read 2 other books that are also the best book that I read this year. But number 3 this year is A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. Oh, this book is so good. He basically wrote the history of the United States from the perspective of the people and the groups who have been oppressed and badly treated by the United States. So he opens up taking a look at the Native Americans. He goes through slavery, the oppression of women. He goes through the whole labor movement, people protesting and unions and going on strikes, and just the way that the workers were so badly treated by those in power. And it's very eye-opening, especially for somebody like me. I grew up conservative Christian, and I went to a conservative Christian school, and my history book told me that Christopher Columbus was a great Christian man. And when you read this book and when you see the reality, Christopher Columbus was evil. He pulled up and he was abusing, maiming, torturing Native Americans. He took them as slaves. And that pretty much goes through with a lot of stuff that I learned about in history, from founding fathers, the evils of slavery, the evils of segregation, that people want to just wash off as, oh, that was in the past. And it's like, I really feel like we need to address that a bit better in our history books. Number 2 is called Walking the Bridgeless Canyon by Kathy Baldock. Walking the Bridgeless Canyon, this is going to take a bit of explaining, is about how Christians have viewed LGBTQ people and where they've gone wrong. So, conservative Christian here, I grew up in the world of it is a sin to be LGBTQ. LGBTQ people are an abomination. Ooh, ah. And for the past couple years, I have been unlearning that psycho stuff. Finding this book and reading this book was so great for me. First of all, it goes through the LGBTQ experience throughout history, especially in the US, how the entire culture was sort of formed around oppressing and hating LGBTQ people. It talks about the conversion therapy that was done, which is evil and should be outlawed and banned forever. They would hook LGBTQ people up to electroshock stuff and then give them medicine that would induce vomiting. And I'm sitting here reading about this, and that is torture. Like, the US was torturing people. The book shows how that whole culture of hatred is more what formed Christians' views of it, more so than the Bible. Because the Bible has exactly 6 tiny little passages that are used to condemn homosexuality. I say used because they don't actually condemn homosexuality, and the book does an amazing job of going through each and every passage that people might use and just showing how it has been taken out of context or else blatantly mistranslated to serve this agenda. This is a really important book, I think, for Christians to read, and I'm really glad that I read it. I bought 2 copies and I've been loaning them out to people, just trying to get this book out there because it is so good. We need to escape this hateful, bigoted mentality Christians do and just start being more loving, accepting, affirming, because holy smokes, the hatred of LGBTQ people in the Christian community is not biblical. This book will tell you why. My number 1 book of the year this year is a book called Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson. This book moved me. Brian Stevenson is a lawyer who works to get people off of death row. The book follows one main story of this black man who was put on death row wrongly. Like, he was innocent of the crime, and so they have this shaky shaky trial, and it just goes through, and now this guy is about to be put to death by the government legally for a crime that he did not commit. And so Bryan Stevenson fights like all heck to get this guy off of death row. In between this main story, it goes through case after case after case of people unjustly tried, sometimes kids tried as adults, and the abuse and things that they suffer in prison. There's a story of a woman who has a miscarriage, buries the baby, and somebody accuses her of not having a miscarriage but actually just killing the child, and suddenly she's facing life imprisonment for having a miscarriage. That's insane. This book just really shows the systemic racism, the evil racism that goes into our justice system so much of the time, and it's just unnoticed by so many people. It also shows how evil capital punishment is. We should not, as a country, be putting people to death for any reason, because what if you're wrong? What if the person is innocent of the crime? It's been proven that innocent people have been put to death. It's just like, why is this still happening? That's crazy. That's insane. If you're gonna murder murderers, you're basically making yourself that same monster that you're claiming those murderers are. So yeah, Just Mercy is moving. It is devastating. Such an important book. And wow, there's a lot of hot takes mixed in with that. I apologize. I know you like your takes lukewarm. I do want to touch base briefly on the worst books that I read this year. I read this book called Re-Jane, which is a remake of Jane Eyre, which I didn't realize when I bought this book, and I bought this book a couple of years ago. But I didn't really like Jane Eyre, but reading Re-Jane was like, oh my gosh, it made me love Jane Eyre because of how bad Re-Jane is. It is so bad. It was just like, ugh. I read this book called The Best of the Harvard Lampoon, which is a collection of comedy short stories that were written by Harvard students for their little Harvard paper thing that they do. And I bought that book a couple years ago as well. At the time, I was looking for comedy books because that's what I was into. It's just not funny. It reeked of pretension because it's all these stupid Harvard bros. I read the book Under the Lilacs by Louisa May Alcott, and I didn't like that one at all. Louisa May Alcott, I love her Little Women trilogy. I thought that was amazing. So I was excited to read this one, and it just hit me with some really cringe stuff. There's this one part where they tell a story about a Native American, and the Native American is just portrayed as this savage killer. And then they also sing a song that's somehow about China, and they just a big portion of the song is just making noises that sound like the Chinese language, and it just felt awkward. I read The Book Thief this year. It is so cringe. It's written from the perspective of death, and it's about World War II, and Holocaust is going on and all this awful stuff, and death is quirky and funny. It reads like a young adult novel, but it's dealing with very serious stuff. The first book she steals is a guide to grave digging. Okay? And I don't believe that book exists. You really need 20 pages to say dig a grave with a pick and a shovel and gloves? What? The last book that I read this year that I thought was bad was called The Reader. And The Reader is bad because, first off, it's a woman kind of having an affair with this child, and the book kind of is this is fine. There's nothing wrong with this, and there's a little bit of abuse that goes into that the book kind of glosses over because it's a love story. It's not an abuse story, so the abuse is loving. And then there's a twist halfway through the book, and the twist I felt is well thought out in terms of this is gonna shock you, but then you're gonna read back on it and be are you really trying to get me to sympathize with this character? Just a couple other books that I did enjoy this year that didn't make it into my top 10 list. I read Beware of Pity by Stefan Zweig. Stefan Zweig is an amazing writer. I read The Road by Cormac McCarthy. Very good, dark, moody book. I read Lud in the Mist by Hope Merles. This book gave me Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell vibes. It's about the politics of this town that lives next to the fairy town. So it's this funky mix of magic and realism that I really enjoyed. Butcher's Crossing by John Williams I read this year, and I really liked that one as well. It starts out feeling oh, this is going to be a boring hunting Western book, and I was not excited about it. But then it turns into this psychotic, just insane, the people in this book just lose their minds with lust for money and skin and all this stuff, and it's awesome. And then I read Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin, which was a really, really good book about self-acceptance and the importance of people accepting others for who they are as well. If this video gets 100 likes, I want to do something big this time around. I am going to be donating $600. I want to give $200 to the Equal Justice Initiative. The writer of Just Mercy, Brian Stevenson, Equal Justice Initiative is his charity where they're working to end capital punishment. I want to do $200 to the AIDS Vaccine Advocacy Coalition. This kind of comes from reading Walking the Bridgeless Canyon and seeing the Christian response to the AIDS epidemic when it broke out was just to say, God is punishing gay people. And that couldn't be further from the truth. Just reading about the way that AIDS has impacted people's lives and the way that people have suffered, and then seeing the Christian response to that was very moving, heartbreaking, and that's why I want to donate $200 to that. And then the last group I want to donate $200 to is the Trevor Project. The Trevor Project is the leading and only accredited national organization providing crisis intervention and suicide prevention services to lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and questioning young people under the age of 25. I think that's a really good charity. I did some research on them, and I want to donate $200 to them as well. One more thing before I go. I know that in my Guy Penrod video and in one of my soap videos, I said I was going to donate to the National Alliance to End Homelessness. I believe we hit those like goals, so I'm going to go ahead and do that at the end of this video. That way you see me doing it and you can hold me accountable. All right, here we are, the National Alliance to End Homelessness. 75 plus 30, I believe, is $105. So that's what I'm doing. Donate today and hope it works. Hey, we did it. Thanks for all your help liking my video, everyone. More to come. Keep liking this one. Keep subscribing. We're gonna get there. And that's all. I filmed way too long for this. Holy smokes. Have a good one, everyone.